Now, tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. Is the United States about to start a war in South America? After seizing a sanctioned oil tanker, which Venezuela called an act of piracy, with a huge naval battle group in the region and following lethal strikes on Venezuelan drug boats, it is really beginning to look as if Donald Trump intends to attack and topple the regime of the dictatorial president Nicolas Maduro. Nobody should feel much sympathy for Maduro. Under him, the economy has collapsed, about a quarter of Venezuela's population has fled, and the likely winner of the last presidential election, the opposition leader Maria Machado, has received the Nobel Peace Prize for her defense of democracy against him. Trump's vehement attacks on Maduro, who he calls a narco-terrorist, might just be bluster. But it might not. Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, about a fifth of the global supply. Like other South American countries, it's been flirting with America's biggest rival, China. This, in other words, is not a local story. We don't know what President Trump's going to do, but if he ignores international law and attacks Venezuela directly, that has serious implications everywhere, from Eastern Europe to Taiwan. A big ripple, as it were, in the New World disorder. Or is that me being alarmist? I asked General Sir Richard Barrons, co-author of Britain's Strategic Defence Review, what he thought.
I think the first point is that this is very serious for Venezuela, because we may be on the threshold of the US at least taking action in Venezuelan airspace, whether it's targeted at the drug cartels or other bits of infrastructure. So that's really serious for Venezuela. The issue for the world, however, is if the US is doing that in its own backyard against a sovereign country such as Venezuela, well, what does that mean for not just US behavior elsewhere, but I think more significantly for other powers in the world like Russia and like China that might follow the example that if you're big enough and bad enough, then the use of force like that in the world we live in has somehow again become acceptable.
To put it even more brutally, if the great empires can do what they like in their own areas, then that means the Russians pretty much can do what they like around Eastern Europe and Ukraine, and the Chinese can do what they like with Taiwan.
So that's the proposition, and the answer to that proposition is now is the time for 500 million prosperous Europeans to match their economic strength to political and military strength and take their own destiny back into their hands. And that means spending more money on defence sooner to make sure that we are resilient and able to deter.
Well, you'll hear more from Sir Richard later on, but sticking with Venezuela, let's talk now to a former Venezuelan government minister, Ricardo Hausmann. He's now Professor of Development Economics at Harvard Kennedy School, and it's fair to say no great fan of the current government there. Thank you very much indeed for joining me, Professor. I mentioned the collapse of the economy. Just for people listening, explain what happened under Maduro and indeed his predecessor, Hugo Chavez.
So if we go just back to 2013, the GDP in 2013 was 4 times bigger than it is now. Wow. It was a decline of 75%, something that has never happened in the world without a war, and much bigger than most wars. So this is a complete destruction of the economy on top of, as you said before, the largest oil reserves in the world. So it's really an unbelievably dismal performance. And I forced 9 million people to leave the country.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I described Maduro as dictatorial. Was that a fair word to use?
I think you were being humble, or you were being moderate. Yeah. I mean, he's been accused as a narco-terrorist. He's been accused of crimes against humanity. And so you know, he's caused enormous pain in this world.
Nonetheless, clearly, if the United States actually tried to invade or topple him, that would be a massive moment, and international law would be involved. I said earlier on that, like a lot of other South American countries, there has been a bit of wooing by and of China, and that China is sort of trying to dig into South America. And I was raising the possibility that this is part of the Trump administration's concern. Just your view on that.
Okay, my view is that we have to recognize that the main actor of the story has been the Venezuelan people. That the reason why Maduro is in trouble is because He lost the election last year, in spite of the fact that he rigged that election big time. He lost it by a landslide, and even though he prevented the 8 million Venezuelans that had left to vote from voting, and he prevented 3 million young people from registering to vote. So in spite of that, he lost by a huge landslide, and that has led the world not to recognize his authority. That has led to sanctions from Britain, from the European Union, from the US, from the democratic powers of the world. He has been reluctant to act, and he has, in fact, strengthened the cartels, the narco organizations in the country as an alternative source of income for the regime. So what we're testing is, the world has been in defense of democracy with a lot of declarations, but Europe was not able to free itself from the Nazis without outside help. And, reality has shown that, we need outside help to get rid of this regime and go back to democracy. And that's what's really at stake.
So you would welcome Trump actually either attacking or invading or certainly destabilizing the Maduro regime?
Well, what we need to do is to convince Maduro that he'll be better off by leaving than by trying to cling to power. I don't think we're talking about a war. I think we're talking about a calculation where we have a dictator that doesn't want to leave. We need to promise him a golden exile somewhere in the world that he can leave and let the country go back to democracy, a democracy that will be protected and defended by the armed forces that simply have to switch sides and go back to respecting the Constitution.
But these absolutely gargantuan crude oil reserves that your country has, that's part of the equation as well. And the United States will want those, won't they?
Well, the United States is a net energy exporter. So they don't need our oil. They export oil.
I thought
China will probably need our oil. Mm. And so I can perfectly see a world in which, we will increase the global supply of oil, but to the benefit of Venezuelans, and the oil will go wherever it's demanded. But I don't think much of it will end up in the U.S. because the U.S. is now a net exporter.
How dangerous a moment is this? And on the upside, what is the kind of Venezuela that may emerge if Maduro goes? In other words, is this a vibrant, happy democracy, prosperous democracy waiting to exist?
Well, I mean, it's amazing, the political movement that has been formed, this incredible unification of the country. I mean, it's amazing to see in all 24 states of the country, in 90% of 335 municipalities, they voted massively for the opposition. In the electoral voting centers that are around military bases, the result was the same as in voting centers away from military bases. So this is a unification of a country in search for a new direction, in search for going back to freedom. It's been an amazingly damaging effect in the country. The fact that 9 million people have left.
Yeah.
It has represented a fracture in every family. We are now all spread out across the world. And the idea that has gained so much traction is the idea that we need to reunify the country, bring people back home, and that's not going to happen until people's rights and liberties are respected, and that can only happen in the context of democracy.
Well, that's a really important perspective. I think it was very important to let people hear. Ricardo, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC. And listening to that was the former U.S. ambassador to Venezuela, Charles Shapiro. Ambassador Shapiro, first of all, do you think that Donald Trump seriously intends to topple Maduro?
I think Donald Trump intends to encourage Maduro to leave. And he's increasing pressure on Maduro. That's what you saw with the seizure of the ship yesterday. The day before, 2 F-18s were flying inside Venezuelan airspace right off Maracaibo. And I would be willing to bet he's got a menu of options to continue increasing the pressure on Maduro. want Maduro and presumably some number of Maduro's associates to leave the country. They could go to Moscow and live next door to the former dictator of Syria and be very happy there.
So I said, at the start of the show, I said, was this saber rattling or was this the preparation for war? And you would say neither of those things. It's a steady squeeze on an individual and his regime. And there is a decent chance of forcing him out without conflict, do you think?
Well, that's what one hopes. I mean, as Ricardo Hausmann said, I mean, the idea is to get Maduro out. The election a year ago was just stolen by Maduro, and he didn't even bother to hide the steal. I mean, that's the amazing thing. It's quite clear to everyone that he stole the election. The regime change was a year ago when Venezuelans voted against Maduro and in favor of Edmundo Gonzalez, the candidate of the United Opposition.
Yes, and indeed they won, I think, by at least 60-40. It was quite a clear win. Yes,
it was like 30% difference.
Yeah, so that's enormous. Let me ask you, however, if this led to a war in which the United States, as it were, intervened directly in Venezuela, isn't the danger that, you know, the kind of world order which restrains China a bit from trying to take Taiwan or restrains Russia in Eastern Europe starts to crumble?
Well, I'm going to disagree a little bit with your supposition. I think we're going to do everything, the United States, the Trump administration, whom I do not work for and which does not consult with me, I think they're going to do everything they can to avoid U.S. troops on the ground in Venezuela. So that scenario that you're rolling out is one that I don't think is going to apply. I certainly hope it doesn't apply. Well,
I'm delighted to hear that. Can I ask you about something else I was saying at the top of the show? You can disagree with that as well. But it seems to me that part of the issue here is the deeper and deeper engagement of China in South America, whether it's Panama or other South American countries, offering loans, offering bridges, offering help, and digging into the economies of those countries, which does appear from Washington to be a strategic threat to the United States, or they feel that that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Look, there's a huge need for infrastructure in Latin America, from Mexico to Argentina. It used to be British capital that paid for our infrastructure development in Latin America. Then it was U.S. capital. U.S. companies, by and large, are not investing in Latin America, nor British companies. Peru needed a new port. The Chinese lent them the money. It's going to operate the port. The Chinese aren't giving it away. They want to be repaid, and they're going to make sure they get repaid. Now, with that also comes political influence in Peru. Now they're going to build a road, a highway from that port across the Andes into Brazil, right?
Yeah.
No, the World Bank, the International Money, you name it, the British government, the U.S. aid agency, nobody lends money for those sorts of gigantic infrastructure programs anymore, except for the Chinese.
And the Panama Canal itself,
a huge challenge for all of us, huh?
The Panama Canal itself was involved in possible Chinese investment, I think.
Yeah, because the Chinese had won the Chinese Hong Kong company had won the concession to operate the ports on either side of the Panama Canal. And that's what, really, the beginning of the Trump administration, you remember Marco Rubio's first trip abroad was to Panama to talk to the Panamanians. And in fact, they abrogated the contract with the Chinese.
So there is a much bigger play going on here. Ambassador Shapiro, thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC. Now it's that time of the season when it's not just the mince pies you might be reaching for, but it's the boxes of tissues and cough drops as well, because flu is back and this year's outbreak could be the worst one in a decade. I'll be talking to some experts to find out why, but the time now, 6:16.
This is LBC. LBC app.
It's 6:18. There is an unusually severe flu virus piling pressure on hospitals. The NHS warns of its worst case Christmas scenario coming, and Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, speaks of a tidal wave of flu tearing through our hospitals as he begs the BMA not to strike. The confrontation between him and militant leaders of resident doctors has become brutal, personalised and very high stakes. As for the rest of us, if you possibly can get the flu jab, 17 million have done that already, then for goodness sake, do so. So is this strain really much more dangerous, and what can we do beyond that to protect ourselves? Let's talk first to the consultant virologist at Adam Brooks Hospital and president of the Naked Scientist podcast, Dr. Chris Smith. Dr. Smith, thanks indeed for joining us. This is being described everywhere as a super flu, but it's not actually a different virus, is it? It's the ordinary flu, but just more.
Every year, the flu makes a grand tour of the globe, and it usually coincides in its arrival in any given geography with the winter time in that geography. And rather like the baton in a relay race, it's passing from one person to the next, because this is exclusively a human infection when it's an epidemic like this. And as it goes from person to person, the virus changes, it mutates, and it gains genetic changes that make it look slightly different. And this year is no exception. The virus has changed, it's gained a handful of these mutations, and they have the effect of changing the appearance of the virus to our immune system. And so this is why we're seeing more cases this year, because this form of the flu is one that we haven't seen before like this, and as a result more people are susceptible, so more people are catching it, and they're catching it symptomatically. In other words, they're not just getting the flu and not realising it, which does happen with a flu that you've seen quite recently. They're catching it and getting symptomatic, and as a result they feel very unwell, and some of them ill enough to go off to hospital.
But to be absolutely clear, when we say super flu, we mean it's more infectious. We don't mean it's doing worse things to you than other flus did.
It's at a population level more of a problem because more people are getting it, but for the individual, this is the same as any flu you could catch in any previous year if you catch the flu. So there's nothing special. We don't think this is clinically more intense, but at a population level, it's a problem because more people have got it, and that puts more pressure on our ability to run a health service.
So without being grisly about it, I think about 8,000 people died of flu last year, and we should expect that number to be bigger this year because we're not even at the top of the wave.
You're right, that the what we call excess mortality, and this is when you look statistically at how many people die. We know that roughly 600,000 people are born and 600,000 to 800,000 people die in our country every single year. And when you look month by month, you can work out, therefore, based on chance, how many people would be expected to die at any one moment in time. You can see a big surge in wintertime in our country every year, and that's true of all countries around the world. And a large fraction of that is attributable to flu. And in a really bad flu year, that number may be as high as 20,000 people. In an average flu year, it's between 5,000 and 10,000 people who die with the flu. Some of them will die of the flu. And it's an important distinction because we label some people as dying of flu, but they may have had flu which was bad enough to put them in hospital or cause other health problems. And it may be the other health problems that then claim their life. But flu is certainly a contributory factor.
So I said earlier on, get the jab if you possibly can. Of course, quite a lot of people are not don't get it available on the NHS because they're not old enough, or they're not pregnant, or perhaps they're not young enough or susceptible enough. For those people, is it sensible to actually go out and buy a jab because you can get it commercially as well?
Everyone can benefit from the flu vaccine because although it's made available for free to people in risk groups, over 65s at the moment, women who are pregnant, because we know they're much more likely to succumb to flu, and also people with underlying health problems and people who are involved in healthcare. Most healthcare trusts will give their staff flu vaccines, and they know that if we do that and we have high uptake, and most trusts around the country are actually declaring quite high levels of vaccine uptake among their staff, 60-70% in some cases. That's very good, and it's on par with what we see in the elderly population in the UK. When we do that, we know that we have fewer staff off work, and it's better for patients because if you can't catch the flu, or you have a lower likelihood of catching the flu because you've been vaccinated, you're not going to put patients at risk.
Really interesting, important information for us all. Chris Smith, thank you so much for that. So what kind of a strain has this been putting on the NHS itself? Let's talk now to the National Medical Director at the NHS, Professor Meghana Pandit. Professor Pandit, thank you very much for joining us. First of all, just picking up from that last conversation, apart from the importance of vaccinations, would you recommend people to wear masks if they're feeling poorly, if they're sneezing or coughing?
Andrew, there are a suite of measures for basic infection prevention and control. And these are vaccination, of course, and as the previous speaker has said, vaccination is very, very important. The other things in that toolbox, if you may, are ventilation. So don't be in crowded spaces. If you're on a bus, open the windows. If you're in a hospital ward, open the windows. Hand hygiene and respiratory hygiene is the next thing. Clean hands with soap and water. And if you're coughing and sneezing, if you're using tissues, please use them and throw them immediately. And then the next is also masks. So all of them taken collectively prevent infections and control infections. Many hospitals are recommending that in emergency areas, their staff wear masks,
yes.
Particularly in hospitals where there are vulnerable patients as well. So I think they're all taken together, rather than any specific one measure.
That's useful. And Professor Pandit, let me ask you about the atmosphere and the pressure inside hospitals, because Wes Streeting's talked about a tidal wave of flu ripping through hospitals, and of course he's in conflict with resident doctors at the moment. But how difficult is it in the hospitals that you know about?
Hospitals are under pressure. There are huge demand of people attending accident and emergency or emergency departments. And coupled with that, a rising rate of flu, which means more than 2,600 patients in hospital beds every day last week with flu. And that could rise further. And imagine the impact of all of that on a staff or workforce who are already exhausted and tired. All of that together means the pressure on hospitals is huge. I
was going to say, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you haven't even hit the peak of the flu yet, have you?
Well, it's very difficult to know when and how this curve will go down, whether it'll rise further or whether it'll come down. But, we anticipate that the numbers will go up.
Final question, without going into the politics of it too much, how much difficulty is the resident doctors' proposed strike going to impose on the NHS?
It is always difficult to manage any strike action because it impacts on patient care. Planned surgeries or clinic appointments are cancelled. There are delays in discharging patients who are on wards. And imagine all of that when we already have a very high demand from flu in the hospitals, with bed occupancy having risen hugely over the last few weeks. So the demand on staff who are exhausted is also huge. And all of that means that strike action at any time, and particularly now, will make it very, very difficult in hospitals with huge pressure.
A hard Christmas ahead for the NHS, Dr. Pandit. Thank you very much indeed for talking to me. Now, quite often, I don't only have to report what somebody says, I also have to explain why they're saying it. Speaking in Berlin earlier today, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary-General, said that Western Europe should be crystal clear. We are Russia's next target, and we are already in harm's way. He went on to warn that the next Kremlin-initiated war could be on the scale of war our grandparents and great-grandparents endured. We know what that means. But it wasn't said just to ruin your evening. NATO believes that voters across Western Europe are grossly complacent and unwilling to pay for stronger defence is essential to prevent another big war. Now, you've already heard from General Sir Richard Barrons tonight, the former commander of Joint Forces Command, but here he is on whether the Rutte warning should be taken seriously.
I think this is serious. I don't think it's necessarily the outcome, but it is a serious risk. The SCR set out that we live in an era of state confrontation and potentially conflict. And for Europe, the issue today is Russia. If Russia is handled well, there is no need for a war. If Russia is handled badly, or there's miscalculation or an excess of ambition, yes, this could become a war in the way that our predecessors in the last century knew it.
Mark Rutte says very clearly that we, the West, and Western Europe in particular, are in the sightlines of the Russians. We are their target, we are their enemy, and it's coming towards us quite fast. Is this, you think, this kind of language because people in the military feel that not just leaders, but also voters, populations across Western Europe are still very complacent, relaxed, and unseeing about the threat that Russia poses?
So first of all, I don't think this really starts with the military. I think the greater risk to the UK and other countries in Europe is to the resilience of our daily life. So Russian intrusion in our cyberspace in the manipulation of social media, in the sort of sabotage we've seen of efforts to support Ukraine, it's clear that below the threshold of military conflict, every single day, Europe is being attacked by Russia. This is rarely above the level of disruption. But we need to understand that if it was amplified and we couldn't do anything about it, it could bring our daily life to a halt. That's the first risk. And the second risk is, perhaps on the back of an outcome in Ukraine, there is a real risk of military conflict with Russia between European NATO, and we must recognize this as European NATO with the certainty of much less US support.
Do you think that voters in this country have noticed enough to support a big increase in military spending of the kind that you and Lord Robertson with the SDR have called for?
So I'm absolutely certain that most citizens of the United Kingdom are not looking at this, don't want to look at it, and are not really steeped in it. And the last budget is an example that as a country, we still prefer to spend our money on welfare, not warfare. And this is why things like the Strategic Defence Review, which are getting more money than ever before, are still only advancing at about half the speed at which the government's own assessment says the risk may materialise.
And we read that the chiefs of the armed forces, of the Navy, the Army and the Air Force, have written in private to the Defence Secretary complaining that the amount of money they have got is not enough for the SDR commitments the government has made.
So I don't know whether they've written or not, but it cannot be any surprise that the service chiefs are finding that the 62 recommendations of the Defence Review are proving very difficult to afford, even with the more money that's on the table. And we always knew there was no more money for 2 years, and then there's only a little bit more money until the 2030s. So what the service chiefs are saying, if you want this review implemented at the speed of the risk we're facing, you'll have to find more money sooner. And if you don't find any more money, you'll have to have less SDR at some point. And that's a very honest debate.
What was your reaction, your personal reaction, if I may, to Donald Trump's remarks about Europe in general and Britain earlier in the week? It appeared to be a moment of emotional turning of the back away from Europe.
So I don't think we can really claim to be surprised. I think this is consistent with what Mr. Trump and Mr. Hegseth and others said in February of this year when they came to Europe. They've been saying very clearly it is inappropriate now for the American taxpayer to subsidize a wealthy Europe in the way of Ukraine. It's in our neighborhood. So I think what we saw in that security strategy is really reflecting what we already know.
There seemed absolutely no chance of Russia suddenly doing a peace deal or wanting to stop this war. Everything that President Putin says goes in the other way. So what do you think the implications are for Western European NATO countries of that turning away?
I think the implications are really clear. The first thing, it is now in Europe's hands to provide Ukraine with the means, and it's about money and weapons and diplomatic support to make sure that the circumstances on the battlefield are managed well enough so that Russia realizes it cannot continue to make progress and the costs will continue to go up. And secondly, when this war culminates, and it will at some point, that it will be Europe that buttresses Ukrainian deterrence so that it is impossible for Russia to think of restarting the war in Ukraine. And thirdly, that the rest of Europe is not going to be an open door to Russia just because we're focused on Ukraine. Those three things are now inescapable.
The new aim in terms of defence spending in this new period of NATO is 3.5% in a few years' time. Is that really enough?
So the first purpose of the SDR was to chart the essential transformation of UK defence for the world we live in. The second question was to match that to the government's preferred funding based on its very accurate reading of where public opinion is. And the fact is there is a gap between those two things. Left to people like me, more money for defence would come sooner to implement the SDR quicker. But that's a political and a societal choice. It's not a military choice.
General Barrons, thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Now up next, a documentary looking at the abuse of prisons in Alabama has been making waves before the awards season, and the director will be with me in just a few moments. But the time now, 6:33, and Amelia Cox has your headlines.
Incarcerates a lot of people, but we see Alabama as kind of the lens through which you can look at the U.S. prison system, and then beyond that, the prison system in the U.K. and even beyond that, because clearly these prison systems have problems, especially when they're allowed to operate in secret.
The first thing to say, I think, about your documentary is that it shows an almost unimaginably brutal environment. I think one of the most hellish places you can end up on earth, I would say. And you call the Alabama prison system a murder factory. Tell us about that.
I have. I mean, everything that they do is this sort of toxic combination of disorganized and incompetent, as well as perverse. So it's not just that they're good at doing things badly in their prisons. They're bad at all of it, and it's partly because, or largely because, people don't get to see inside these prisons. So democracy dies in darkness, but so do people.
And there is a strongly racialized element to all of this story. I mean, a lot of the prisoners are black prisoners. And I was astonished by how many are actually working for kind of slave labor pay, frankly, inside and outside, including clipping the grass in the governor's mansion and working in chicken factories and fast food outlets, almost like indentured slave labor.
Sure. Well, in the U.S. we had this sort of concept of convict leasing, which sort of replaced slavery by saying, well, let's lock up as many people as we possibly can, especially black people, but poor people for the most part, and let's put them to work because it's so profitable to do so. It worked well during slavery for the commercial interests, if not for the human beings. But it's interesting that, I spoke to one of the wardens and I said, do you think of this in a racial way? And he said, no, we think of them all as N-word. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, the black ones, the white ones, it's just, the poor people, the ones that, they're all sort of that N-word to us. He wasn't endorsing it. He's actually one of the better people I met. But he was just saying that, when you're incarcerating a big segment of your population, especially the people that are destitute, you're not taking care of anybody. And I think it does go beyond race. One of the main storylines in the film involves a young white man who was killed by a black prison guard.
Who's this?
Well, I know you're grieving and mourning, but I wanted to tell you that your son was beaten to death by an officer. That was a murder. They sweep stuff underneath the rug all the time about this.
I called the warden this afternoon. An hour later, there was a statement on the news that he rushed out of his cell with 2 homemade weapons and attacked them.
A plastic knife. They always come up with something to justify excess brutality and use the force.
In that way, it's a little post-racial because you see black guards killing black prisoners, you see white guards killing black prisoners, you see black guards killing white prisoners.
But this use of indentured labor, using prisoners as cheap or free labor, I mean, it's obviously not limited to the United States. It's the kind of thing the Communist Party does in China.
Sure. I mean, where you have human beings who are in the control of the state, you typically put them to work, and when prison labor and free labor becomes this profitable, you can bet you'll see more of it. So it's a very hard addiction to get people to abandon when if you run a business and you look at your financials, if you could zero out the element that involves paying people, the business looks a lot better. In Alabama, they have now $450 million a year in unpaid labor. Wow. And as you say, I think a lot of people think, it's understandable that you might ask them to sweep up inside the prison or to serve meals to their fellow prisoners. Maybe you don't think that they're working on road crews, construction crews for the state, working in the governor's mansion. And very few people recognize that they're working for the Budweiser distributor, they're working for McDonald's, they're working for Burger King, Kentucky Fried Chicken. So it is very disturbing that they're tapping into that. And the reason I say it's forced labor is that even if it's not written down in the law books that it's forced, it is clearly forced because they, if a prisoner has the audacity to say that they're not well that day or they don't choose to work for free, there are a whole series of punishments, right, that are very similar to the punishments we saw during slavery. In this case, they can extend your sentence, so you're in prison for longer. They can send you to a much more dangerous facility if they want. They can put you in solitary confinement, which the UN defines as torture. It's just a very clear forced labor environment.
This conversation keeps slipping back to words like slavery, and we keep thinking again back to the Civil War. And the title of your film, The Alabama Solution, is really a states' rights issue, because the Alabama administration are determined to keep the Federal Department of Justice out of their prisons at all costs.
It's true, but it's also the case that we do this incarceration thing badly throughout the United States. You know, just in upstate New York, very recently, we had a man named Robert Brooks who was murdered by corrections officers on cameras. They didn't realize they had their body cam. In the state of California, they have people going to classes in stand-up prison cells where they can't even sit down, individual cells. But there's a tremendous amount of brutality because the Supreme Court has said that wardens can deny access to journalists simply by saying, well, for reasons of security or safety.
Yeah.
And the reality is it's just cheaper and easier for them to be able to do whatever they want, and they don't end up controlling the violence and the way the prisoners are treated.
We were in these walled-off secret societies. These are state institutions. But it's one of the only state institutions that the public or the media has no access to. How can a journalist go into a war zone but can't go into a prison in the United States of America? Like, I can witness a murder. We could be all sitting here and witness a murder. In the media, it can't even come on the state property.
And some of the most violent people, the staff of the prisons, are actually supported and paid for their legal fees by the state itself. In other words, they are backed by the state.
Yeah. There's a particular officer in the film named Roderick Gadsden who's been involved in, I think, more than 20 violent incidents that really are chilling. I mean, they always result in broken bones and lacerations, if not the death of the person that he's been beating. And the department has promoted him twice. Since the death of Stephen Davis in our film, this man has been put in charge of the CERT team, which is the special response team. And when we ask why they haven't fired him, they say, well, you know, it's really hard to fire people. You know, they go to the personnel board or the corrections officers rally around them. So they end up with sort of a state-sanctioned murder.
Andrew, apart from the theme of the film, which is absolutely fascinating, it's very interesting the way the film was made, because it starts with your camera crew going into the prison and being shown the kind of happy, smiling, sort of Potemkin face of the prison, you know, what they would like people to see. And then you realize there's something going on behind the scenes. We often criticize the world of smartphones, but smartphones have allowed a different kind of journalism to take place.
That's certainly true. We didn't realize that there were cell phones available in the prisons. Just was sort of, from my standpoint, I couldn't believe that was the case. But because the prisons are so disorganized, so poorly managed, they also can't manage the contraband. And in fact, the guards are the ones that are bringing in the vast majority of the drugs. The guards are the ones that are bringing in the cell phones. So it's kind of ironic that the cell phones that are being used in our film by prisoners to demonstrate the brutality of the guards are sold to the prisoners by the guards.
Yeah.
And at some level, it's sort of an indication of how they've been able to operate with impunity. They can't imagine that they would be held accountable for that. And I don't want to say that it's the guards exclusively, and there are decent guards in prison. The reality is the whole system is organized for this.
Every day I thought I should be participating in this. There's just so much stuff happening in there. So now there's a lot of officers leaving.
Sometimes we have one officer for 200-300 inmates. With the low staffing and the mandatory overtime, you've got officers that look like zombies.
That's the cube. Ain't no police in the cube. None. Ain't no police in the dorm. Nowhere in the dorm. How do we get help?
This film is already being talked about, winning lots of awards in film ceremonies and so on. Do you think it could be so successful that it actually makes a difference to the Alabama prison system?
You know, I think so. And I think there's a lot of urgency to it because just last month, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission issued new rulings saying that now the prisons should be allowed to put in cell phone blockers. So it's typical that rather than addressing the real problem, the inhumanity in the system, they're saying, well, how do we put a lid on the information coming out? The good news is that the film is starting to activate people, not just in the U.S., but also here. We just did a screening a few days ago here in London, and it was packed, first of all, and many of the people there were coming from the sort of justice reform side, not just people that are interested in films. So we do think that we're putting real pressure on the state of Alabama, but the idea is to put pressure on the whole system, including here, to make people understand that they've got to be able to see inside these institutions and protect the people that we're supposed to be taking care of.
That is great to hear. All I can say is the very best of luck. Andrew, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Ping pong, which is the sending of legislation back and forth between the Commons and the Lords because they can't agree, sounds almost playful. But it is deadly serious, particularly when the Lords is blocking the employment rights legislation that Labour promised in its manifesto. Tonight, this row is ripping through the Parliamentary Labour Party. Angela Rayner, the former deputy leader, has now got involved. LBC's political correspondent, Aggie Chambre, is with me.
Now, Andrew, this is not the first time that the Lords have basically sent back this legislation to the Commons, but it is the first time since this compromise was reached, and I do not think the government was expecting this to happen.
The specific issue is about how much compensation you can get if you're unfairly dismissed.
Exactly. So as part of this compromise that was basically put together, and Angela Rayner was also involved in that, there was this sort of 11th hour measure to scrap the compensation caps for unfair dismissal. The other big part of the compromise, that instead of day one right to protection against unfair dismissal, there would be unfair dismissal rights after 6 months. So I think this was not expected, but there was a Tory call to force a review of the existing compensation limits, and it was rejected in the House of Lords by a majority of 24. And that number is significant, Andrew, because the other thing that happened yesterday was Sir Keir Starmer announced a nomination of 25 new Labour peers.
So if they had been there, this wouldn't have happened. So it's a very important constitutional but also political moment, yeah.
Indeed, and they won't actually come into the House of Lords until the 8th of January, and Downing Street wants to get this through before Christmas.
Very tight. Now, you have another story to tell us about. We often, sneer at parliamentarians for being a bit weak and feeble, but you have counter-evidence to bring us.
Indeed, I do, Andrew. So this is a story that starts in Istanbul. Dame Rosie Winterton, Baroness Winterton, was there, and she broke her wrist. And as soon as she landed back in the UK, she went straight to A&E to St Thomas's Hospital. She was bandaged up. She got a sling, a cast and everything. And then she came out. She was standing outside on her phone. And a hooded man on a bike came up to her and tried to grab her phone. And there was this sort of, what she describes as a tug of war, back and forth, a brief tussle. And the man eventually had to give up. Rosie Winterton won the day. And she credits her mobile phone lanyard with the success in keeping her phone.
Not all MPs, not all parliamentarians are wimpy. Aggie, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, it's that time of week when I'm joined by my political panel next. We're going to find out their insights on more reform chaos, a political coup in number 10, and Donald Trump's Europe bashing. But the time now, 6:51.
Coming up,
Hayward and Poppy Coburn, deputy comment editor at the Telegraph. They both had rich pickings. Freddie, let me start with you, because you had an absolutely cracking piece this week about Nigel Farage and his relationship with Trump and MAGA, and what that might mean in due course for British politics. Now, there's a lot to say about that, but I must ask you about an extraordinary anecdote you tell about being at a party with a MAGA tech bro guy, in terms of how much they really dislike us.
Right, yeah. So I'm at this party in Washington, and you meet people that are much more extreme than you do in London. That's just a base level for the conversation. This guy comes up to me, and we're talking about Nigel Farage and whether he's going to be the person to save Britain. He sort of stops me and says, what someone needs to do is to go into Parliament and spray it. And in my sort of English naivety, I thought he was talking about an Extinction Rebellion type of prank, but no, he was talking about a gun. I mean, there's a sense in America right now...
Spray it with bullets.
Spray it with bullets. There's a sense in America right now that Britain has fallen, that they look with agony at what's happening in the UK. They, in their eyes, they see it as overrun by Muslims. They think there's a free speech crisis. And these are genuine, deep-seated feelings. I think sometimes in the UK we think that this is just some far-right conspiracy and they don't really mean it. They do. And they care about it so much because they see the UK as their ancestral homeland. So it fits into the America First narrative more than we think.
And in general, right across the MAGA world, Nigel Farage is an absolute hero.
Yes, he's seen as a prophetic figure, a godfather, like a jolly old uncle that has been going to Washington for 4 decades now. He worked for an American investment bank back in the 80s, and he would originally go and do trades in New York. But now for the past decade or so, he's been going to Washington and cultivating these connections with the people that would eventually take power.
Really interesting. Let's talk about the man whose job is to stop Nigel Farage becoming Prime Minister, at least in theory, Keir Starmer, because, Poppy, he has had an absolutely miserable week if he's listening to the rumours.
Yeah, I mean, I have to keep saying this is the worst week for the Labour government so far. I think I've said that about a dozen times now over the last couple of months.
It's always true, though.
It's always true. Unfortunately, it is. I mean, there was the humiliating spectacle not that long ago of them briefing out about Wes Streeting's potential ability to cause a leadership challenge to Keir Starmer, which then he had to refute live on air. He was about to do a media round. He's come back again. He's actually done an interview in the New Statesman, Wes Streeting, this week, where, as usual, he's not quite come out and said that he wants to do a leadership challenge, but has hinted at it so heavily.
It's a maintenance government.
Of course. So it's not just Wes Streeting. We obviously have the return as well, potentially, of Angela Rayner. We've now seen that Burnham is still very keen to try and get himself on and needle into the process as well. I think the thing that's very unfortunate for Keir Starmer is that he's heading into a new year with very little shape for himself. There are very few MPs now that actually want to come out and defend him. I think his strongest ability to stop a leadership challenge from happening is to point to the last government and say, did it make any difference to the Conservative Party? Well, no, it didn't. It was obviously very embarrassing. If he goes and a new Prime Minister were to come in this year, that will be our 7th Prime Minister in a decade. I mean, that is kind of remarkable.
Absolutely astonishing.
That's the sort of thing we used to laugh at Europeans for. You know, we used to laugh at the Italians for having prime ministers that were in for 100, 150 days. You wouldn't actually remember who they were because they couldn't do anything. Well, that's Britain now. As soon as we have political problems, we think that the best thing to do is just chuck off the leader and get someone else in.
And a question really for both of you. We're beginning to see what I think is the beginning of a Conservative revival. Not really that much in the polls, but more or less in Kemi Badenoch's face. You can see that she's more relaxed and happier at Prime Minister's questions than she's been for a long time. Are we good? I mean, we're talking about reform, but we must also talk about the Tories. You know, they've still got plenty of MPs, and they're going to try and fend off Nigel Farage.
Maybe I've seen very little to give hope to the Conservative Party over the past few years. We have to remember that the fundamentals of politics has not changed. The problem that Keir Starmer has and the establishment overall is that they've not dealt with the problems that give rise to the anger in the country right now, which is fueling Nigel Farage's rise. Where is the big plan to change radically the country? Why is Rachel Reeves just adopted the economic orthodoxy of the past 15 years, been so loyal to that she's not offered any hope or any change? And that's what the left need to do right now. They need to recognise the only way in which we can prevent the rise of a Trump-like figure or some of the more thuggish and ugly aspects of the MAGA movement that I see every single week in Washington is by having a radical policy both on immigration and on the economy.
I quite like the idea of Nigel Farage as being the bulwark against the far right in the UK.
That's what he says too, to be fair.
I do think there's a lot of truth in that. I mean, about where Kemi Badenoch is, I do think she looks more relaxed. I think she's performing better in PMQs. In terms of what that actually means for her party, I think, unfortunately, very little. I mean, we saw the same thing after Conservative Party conference. I was talking to Tories who were buoyant as if they just won a general election, and actually in the polls it made very little difference. Now, it is notable that they are not slipping further, and of course that has arrested some of Reform's rise, because they really can only survive or continue to grow by picking up disillusioned former Conservative voters. I think they've probably taken everyone they can now get from the Labour Party. And of course that then raises questions of, as we get closer to the general election, is that pact between the Tories and Reform, which they both say is not going to happen, but I think we all know probably is.
Force majeure. Final thought very quickly, Freddie. What is the one thing that you think we should all understand about a Farage government based on what you've been observing in Washington and the kind of conversations he's been having?
Well, it's that he has this relationship with America that we don't fully appreciate. We all know that he's friends with Donald Trump. We can all picture that photo in front of the Golden Door, and we recognise that there is this connection between himself and the Oval Office. But what we should also understand is that those connections go much, much, much deeper. There are many people within the Reform, many people in the administration have been who have been going to conferences for years now. They have a personal rapport. They have a respect for each other. And the big question is, what does Farage do with that connection, that relationship that he's built up?
This kind of revival of white Christian civilization.
Well, yes. I mean, Farage did actually put that to me in the piece, which was a bit of a shock. I mean, he does use different language when he goes over there, which he doesn't so much use here.
Okay, well, we're out of time. Thank you both very much indeed. If you've missed any of today's show, you can listen back on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion, put your news categories in the order you'd like them, pause, rewind live radio, listen to a range of podcasts. So download the all-new official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, Ben Kentish, but right now it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew. Has done. All it will serve to do is make us more uncompetitive and more unprofitable. Do you as a worker really feel that you need these extra rights? At 8, Simon Marks and Aggie Chambre join me to take your calls in Ask the Correspondent. And at 9, David Lammy wants to expunge the criminal records of people who commit criminal offences in their teenage years. Is he right to do this?
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.